Welcome to the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight Podcast, the show that takes a deep dive into local businesses and the individuals that run our community. To guide you along the way, here's your host, Jacob Bittner.
Yeah. Cheers. Cheers to an afternoon in the radio station, having a little beer here. We're wasting no time getting into the beer of the week. You couldn't get that beer open fast enough when you sat down here to do this podcast. What a great way to unwind here this afternoon.
Absolutely. Hey? It's refreshing and delicious. Love Outstate. So yeah.
Get into that mic a little bit
All
more
right.
there for the people. So I'm here with Jake Thomason, Cadem Law Group. We're talking about criminal defense. I had Becca Marsnick on. She's a public defender, so I always recommend people check out other interviews in adjacent industry, because we went into a lot of the history of public defense in America. You have the right to attorney. If you cannot afford one, an attorney will be appointed to you. All of that public defense stuff, we unpacked all that with Becca. So we're going to be talking about the public or the private defense or the criminal defense that you have to pay for.
Correct.
And you spent some time on the other side as a prosecutor.
Correct. Yes, I was a county prosecutor for 7 years.
So we'll get a little bit of a kind of overview of both sides of that and how you kind of fell into your role now and all of it. So you got the edge catcher, because we had an edge catcher left from our beer of the week a few episodes ago. But I've got this, and by all means, feel free to enjoy some of this Pivot Pills. This is this Pivot Pills is, I hope it's around for at least a few more weeks at Outstate. I think they're on to their last few kegs of it. But when things don't go according to plan, you must pivot. But that does not stop Outstate from creating a delicious lager using 100% German malt. They brew this pills with cashmere hops in the kettle and dry hopped with I looked this up and I'm going to butcher it now. Hallertau, Mittelfrüh. That's a type of hop. What a mouthful. But this lager drinks crisp and clean with a subtle cracker-like sweetness and lemongrass melon hop flavor. So this Pivot Pills, 5.2% ABV, 20 IBU, and by the time you're hearing this, it might be gone at Outstate. So get it while it's there, get it while it's good. So we also have a new sponsor. I always like to mention new sponsors, and this one's kind of fun because they've got a little radio jingle. So you might hear the Fergus Home and Hardware. You might hear some sound drops every once in a while. So shout out Fergus Home and Hardware, joining the list of sponsors: Atlas Outdoor Services, Stumbino's, Victor Lundeen's, and Lakes Area Grow Co. So looking forward to whatever this brings and all the people that are on board. We really, really, really appreciate that. So, all right, Jake Thomason, let's get into your background before we talk about law. How did you come to be? How old are you?
I am 37.
37. Okay.
Yes. So I'm originally from the Stillwater metro area. That is where I grew up. That is where my wife is from as well. What brings me to Fergus Falls was obtaining a job at the Ottertail County Attorney's Office as a prosecutor, which I was there for 7 years. That's the reason I'm up here. And then ultimately decided to make the switch to private practice. Was made a very, very good offer at the Cadem Law Group, and I've been there for well over a year now.
So where'd you say you graduated high school?
Stillwater High School.
Stillwater. And then went off to college?
At the U of M Duluth.
University
and
of
then law school at William Mitchell, which is now Mitchell Hamlin University down in St. Paul.
Okay. So growing up, how young were you when you decided you wanted to be a lawyer?
Probably at the end of college. I was looking at possibly law enforcement, some sort of government work. Wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do. Did go to law school with the intention of being a prosecutor and ultimately did accomplish that.
Okay, so prosecutor, defense, all this stuff. When you're a prosecutor, you work for the county.
Correct.
You're employed by the
Yes,
county,
the government, yes.
Essentially on behalf of the state to make sure that people who committed crimes end up being proven guilty of them and serving those sentences or paying those fines.
Right. Addressing public safety, holding people accountable for what they did, but also there's a large part of rehabilitation, getting people into the programs they need, because that also serves public safety as well, to get people back on track, or at least that's something that I've always strongly believed in as well. So yes, it's public safety, it's accountability, but also that getting people back on track and so they don't commit further crimes, because obviously that's the goal.
So you asked me, or we brainstormed a few like topics to dive into today.
Sure.
So obviously we're going to talk about your story, how you got involved with Cadem Law and what they do, obviously what the firm does, all the services there. But I have here some notes on the history of criminal defense. I want to talk about the local legal structure, how like the courts are actually processed from the local level through up to the state level. There's this new veterans law.
Right.
Do you want to talk about that now or later? I mean, that's a big one, right? For you, that's a big topic.
It really is. Yeah, we could talk about that now or later, but I certainly want to do a deep dive into that. That's become a pretty big passion of mine and something that I've been actively working on, including today. So if we want to jump into that
is
now.
Is it the Veterans Restorative Justice Act? Is that what we're talking about, or is that a different thing?
Well, it's the Veterans Mitigation Act is the so 609.1056 specifically under Minnesota statute. But the gist of it is that when a military veteran has been charged with a criminal defense, and the applicable criminal defenses are pretty wide. It only really excludes from applicability the highest level of felony charges. Everything else falls within its jurisdiction. And essentially what it is if you have a military veteran and it can be shown that they have an applicable condition, which means PTSD, chemical dependency, some sort of issue, and that issue can be documented as connected to their military service. If you can connect those two dots and then the crime they are charged with can arguably be shown to be connected to that applicable condition, then the defendant can be placed on what's called pretrial diversion, which means they do not plead guilty. There is no conviction on their record. They essentially have to comply with some conditions, but as long as they do that, and there's a set time period of how they have to follow through with that, ultimately their case is dismissed, which is an extremely beneficial outcome, in particular if the veteran is facing serious level felony charges. But it takes a lot of legwork and a lot of expertise to get the proper documentation in place in order to effectuate the law.
We had this conversation. It's not a get out of jail free card, but it kind of is a get out of jail free card in a lot of instances if people meet this criteria, or it's rather than jail time, they're focusing on other rehabilitation efforts. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want to call it a get out of jail free card, because there's work to be done. The veteran has to show that they are willing to accept treatment, participate treatment, and provide documentation that they are getting a handle on it. It isn't just a walk away type of deal.
What are some? And I don't know if you can get into specifics of cases or not. So some of that stuff's public, I'm sure, that you can talk about. But what are some examples of like applications for this that you've seen or dealt with?
Sure. Yeah. And I can certainly talk about general speaking. I do have some active cases that I can't get into too much detail on, but a general example. So DWIs are common, because obviously veterans who come back, especially those who have been in combat zones, develop PTSD. And it's common knowledge that PTSD and alcoholism and or other chemical dependency kind of go hand in hand. So as we see very often, you have a veteran with alcoholism or some form of chemical dependency gets a DWI. obviously that chemical dependency, if it can be shown it's linked to PTSD or otherwise, service, that makes them eligible to be put on this diversion because they have this chemical dependency because they serve their country. That's what the law is going after. Another example is if a defendant is charged with, say, a violent offense. And in particular, in a scenario where they're clearly having a mental health episode, threatening suicide, has access to weapons, things like that, very commonly that's attributed to PTSD, which can be connected to some sort of military service. So it requires documentation. You can't just roll into court and say, hey, judge, this is what's going on, order the diversion. You got to prove it. But that tends to be the toughest part and why these veterans do need legal representation, because it takes a lot of time to deal with the Veterans Administration. It's a bureaucracy. It's a federal bureaucracy.
Is this unique to Minnesota? Is this this is a Minnesota statute you mentioned?
Correct.
This is a state by state thing? Is there a nationwide push for this sort of thing?
I'm not aware of a push for duplicate laws like this in other jurisdictions. Veteran courts are a specialty court, which are increasingly common in Minnesota as well as across the nation. And we can talk a little bit about that when we start talking about the drug court and the treatment courts, because they're pretty similar. So Otter Tail does not specifically have a veterans court right now. I believe there is a push to get into that. I couldn't say necessarily what's going on in other states, but this mitigation act is pretty new to Minnesota.
Interesting. Well, we might touch on that more. That'll probably tie into the structure of the government, the structure of the processing of the crimes. I want to touch on not necessarily so much marijuana legalization, but more so the connection, disconnection, potential discrepancies between national law, local law, state law, and how those tend to contradict each other or work with or against each other. I just have some questions about that.
Sure.
And then this is a really interesting topic that I'm excited to get into, is the social media stuff, and the Big Brother is watching, and how these tech companies probably have algorithms that predict what people are most likely to commit crimes, what kind of crimes, when these crimes are going to occur. Like, their future of predicting crime, I think the future is now when it comes to that stuff. I just don't know. I know there's laws to protect us or protect the people from being looked at like ants under a microscope from the big government, but maybe there's not. So I'm curious to get into that with you a little bit too. But let's go back to college in Duluth, graduating. How many years do you have to go to college to be a lawyer? 8, 6?
7. So 4 years of undergraduate, would be typically the minimum. Obviously, some people graduate early or late, but generally you're at a 4-year university, and then law school is 3 years.
Okay.
So not quite as long as medical school or something like that, but yeah. It's a fair chunk of schooling to do. And
I talked to Becca about the bar and all of that, and she said it's a lot. It's as overwhelming as you could think it is. But she did well on it. She passed her first time. You passed the bar your first time?
Correct, I did.
There you go. How long of a process is that studying for, test for? I mean, obviously you're studying for it all through law school. The 3 years you're in law school, you're studying for that test.
Right. So, yeah, in theory, you're studying for the bar always, but typically what happens is after you graduate, after you get that Juris Doctorate degree, there isn't a whole lot of time to celebrate graduating law school and receiving that degree, because you immediately need to pivot into studying for the bar. I mean, if you want to get your law license, get your job, start paying off that student debt, you need that license, because that's really all that really matters at that point. So typically what happens, with myself included, you buckle down immediately. Some people don't really do anything other than studying for the bar leading up to it. Lots of people, myself included, take a bar preparation course. So it's actually classes that you pay for on top of law school, specifically helping you to pass the bar, which, while expensive, is kind of an insurance policy. I did that program, and I was happy that I did, because I was able to pass the first time. The test itself is very arduous. It's 2 full 8-hour days.
Whoa.
One entirely of multiple choice, and then
You're sitting there for 8 hours?
yeah, 2 days in a row.
2 days in a row.
Mm-hmm.
They give you lunch breaks and stuff and bathroom breaks?
Right, but
Yeah.
you're so hyper focused. It's but yeah, 2 full days.
How many questions is that?
I don't even remember.
2
It's a
8-hour
lot.
days. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and then the second day is essay writing. So
Interesting. So coming out of law school, then you started looking for jobs, probably threw out applications all over the place, found job openings, and Otter Tail County called.
correct. Yeah, and it was the legal market in particular when I graduated 2013 was pretty bloated. And it was really tough. And so throughout law school, I had done clerkships with like Ramsey County attorney and and offices like that in various capacities, trying to get into those offices. And ultimately, it really wasn't happening. Did some other legal jobs here or there. But beyond that, yeah, Greater Minnesota ended up being the calling, and I honestly don't regret it. It's been a fantastic move. My wife's here, we've got kids here, we live here.
So you've been here for 10 years?
We've been here for 8 years.
8 years.
Yeah.
Okay. And you got hired by the county, and that was your first job in law?
My first full-time permanent job in law, yes. So I had clerked for the Ramsey County Attorney's Office, it basically as a temporary capacity, and so I was operating as an attorney there.
What do you do as a clerk? You have to be a lawyer to be a clerk?
So law clerks are typically law students, so you don't have your law license. However, Minnesota is unique where they have student practice laws. So you can be in law school, and as long as you are under the supervision of an attorney, you can actually practice in the courtroom and do hearings, which I did, which was extremely beneficial. It helped me out, get my career jump-started quite a bit. So yeah, Minnesota is one of the few states where as a law student, you can jump right in there in court and practice just as long as you're supervised by an actual licensed attorney.
And then how long were you on the prosecution side of things before you got in with Cadem here?
So I was a prosecutor with Otter Tail County for 7 years. I clerked with Ramsey County as a law student for 2.5. After that, I had a 6-month contract doing juvenile prosecution as well as a 6-month contract doing child protection down in Ramsey County.
Juvenile and child protection, or juvenile prosecuting and child protection. Talk about that. Talk a little bit about that period of life.
It's a different world
in
down
St.
there.
Paul.
Yeah, it's a different world down there, as people can probably imagine. It's tough. You're doing juvenile prosecution, and while you're dealing with kids, they are kids. Between the ages of 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. But you have kids who are in gangs, who are committing homicides, pretty serious crimes. During that juvenile prosecution, I would say down in St. Paul, the bulk of what we were charging was first degree aggravated robbery, which were people basically getting mugged on the streets by
Kids.
groups of kids. And all the messiness that comes with that.
Interesting. So you didn't enjoy that so much. It was probably quite a bit of a relief to move out here to Minnesota, where, I was talking to Becca, and most of the stuff that happens in our county is drug related, some domestic disturbances. I don't want to say it doesn't happen, but we're blessed in the sense that we do avoid a lot of the big bad. Like, it's rare when you hear about a shooting or something around here. It just doesn't. We don't have that level of violence here, so there must be some type of a relief moving into outstate Minnesota. Sure.
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest differences is kind of what you touched on, is there's much less stranger on stranger crime. As opposed to, as we know, in Otter Tail County and Fergus Falls. The chances of you walking downtown Fergus Falls and getting mugged late at night is pretty low. That doesn't really happen a whole lot. The vast majority of the time when someone is the victim of a violent crime, they almost always know who the person is. And from a prosecutor perspective, that can be greatly beneficial when you are almost never dealing with a case of mistaken identity or trying to prove who the defendant is. Most of the time, that's answered for you. So that part can be a lot easier as a prosecutor, not having to deal with that hurdle.
Interesting. There's less like senseless crimes, like things around here have a little bit more motive. Like easier to identify the motive as opposed to just senseless crime, stranger on stranger.
Right. I mean, things could certainly be senseless, but in terms of, running to the issue of like, do I have the right person?
Right.
You typically don't have that. You typically know who you're dealing with. Now, whether or not you can prove that person intended to do something or whatever the elements are, obviously a different story by a case-by-case basis. But typically up here, you're not dealing with that hurdle of like, well, do we even have the right person that we're looking for? Typically, that's answered for you.
Did you went to trial a lot more as a prosecutor working for the county than you do as like a defender now? Would you say that's accurate? Like Becca goes to trial a lot as a public defender.
Right. That would probably be one of the biggest differences. Yes, as a prosecutor, you do what you can to settle a case, but obviously there's certain parameters in that. You're not an effective prosecutor if you are just dismissing everything and not willing to actually take something to trial. And in fact, that can be kind of damaging reputation-wise if all of a sudden you're kind of known as the prosecutor who just never takes anything to trial, because then it incentivizes defense attorneys to just hold you to the fire in hopes that you'll get what you want and they'll get what they want. So you do have to be able to do that. And yeah, as a prosecutor, I think I had upwards to 30 jury trials during my time at the county attorney's office. Yeah, you have to be prepared to do that. And yes, the public defenders, they have a duty to their client to handle the case how the client wants to handle it, typically speaking. And yeah, you're going to have clients who are going to insist on their trial, whether or not that is within the legal advice of the attorney. You're certainly going to have those. And, her client base is large. It is for any public defender. So yes, that is absolutely true. And the other difference here is for private attorneys, it requires more money to go to trial outside of that initial representation.
There's more incentive for the client to settle and not pay you to go to trial than
some
if you're
circumstances.
in a public defense situation.
In some circumstances, yes.
Interesting. So how did the connection come through with Cadem? Obviously, you were probably on the other side of the aisle from them for a while, and then the opportunity came where they were looking for a defense lawyer.
Right. Yeah. And so I have known Mr. Cadem as well as his wife, Mrs. Carolyn Cadem, for a long time. I went to law school with Carolyn. She graduated my class, so we've known each other a long time. And then, throughout my entire career, I had multiple criminal cases against Chris, and that just born a mutual respect. We both know that we work hard. We both know that we know what we're doing. We both know that if we have to litigate and go to court, we're going to go to court and litigate. So while we battled a lot and had obviously a lot of disagreements, there was always that mutual respect there and that mutual professionalism. And so it became quite easy to start working with him and join his firm because I already knew him. He already knew me.
How long has that firm been around for?
Ooh, that's a good question. I should probably know how long Cadem Law Group's been around. I do know Chris has been at it for decades.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as far as how many people are involved in that, it's him, his wife,
myself, and we're so 3 attorneys.
Just the three.
The 3 of us, and then and our support staff.
How many people go into that support staff?
So we only have 3 right now. We have our receptionist and then 2 other paralegals. So we're a pretty lean operation, but frankly, we kind of like it that way.
And a paralegal just helps with the busy work. I don't know why I think that. Like, what does a paralegal do? They just help you with all the writing, all the stuff, and doing all the busy work, or what?
They do a lot. So yeah, shout out to Sam, Tracy, and Anna over at Cadem Law Group. Absolutely phenomenal job. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of organization, keeping track of things, keeping track of deadlines, managing.
You want to try some of this pills too here?
Sure, yeah.
Have you had this one before?
I don't believe so.
The pivot pills.
So they do a lot of that organizational stuff, making sure our calendars are clear. And then they do a lot of our intakes as well. So if you call our firm looking for a consult, you'll be speaking with one of our staff members who's going to be taking basic information. They're very good at asking the right questions and getting that preliminary information down for us, doing conflict checks, making sure that, we are able to represent somebody. So we try to do a lot of that on the front end. And so they'll take a whole bunch of notes for me and then transfer me the call. And I've almost always got a real good head start on how to help this person.
And at Cadem, are you guys all criminal defense? Do you guys do family law, that sort of stuff? Or is it, I suppose, talk about the differences. Because there's a family, that's kind of one of the things I want to get into is the structure, the law structure, because there's a bunch of different kinds of courts I'm learning.
Oh, absolutely. So yes, we do family law. So Carolyn Cadem does the vast majority of our family law cases. However, I have some myself.
And that's like divorce, that sort of stuff?
Divorce, child custody, sometimes child protection matters, child support, all that type of stuff. So yeah, I do have some of those cases myself. Carolyn primarily does those, but they can become intertwined with criminal matters as well. It's not uncommon for somebody who got in some criminal trouble and then that triggered a divorce or some sort of child custody matter, and then they need help with that too. And so it can be very beneficial having all the inside knowledge on that criminal file and where it's going to go or possibly go, what evidence has been disclosed there, and very often it can be kind of intertwined with the child custody matter. We also do civil hearings for harassment restraining orders and orders for protection, which those can very frequently be intertwined with either criminal matters if a violation has been charged.
I bet you there's some restraining orders that happen around Fergus Falls. There's probably some of that going on around here.
Oh yeah, yes. That's been a large part of our business as well. Helping people support their petitions and get them proven up in court, and also defending against them. I've been on either side of those matters. But yes, matters very frequently become intertwined. If you have someone who's subject to an order for protection, we call them an OFP, and they're also simultaneously accused of violating that and have a criminal charge, it's nice to have an attorney who can look at all of that together.
So they do business law. That's a different thing. That's more accountants, but there's a lot of law that goes into that. Do you guys on retainer for businesses as well?
Not as much of our wheelhouse. What we do, and the firms in the general area are usually pretty good about this. If something's not in our wheelhouse, we'll refer it to another firm that we think does. So, and vice versa. So we will get referrals for criminal defense from other firms who, for whatever reason, decide they can't take that case for whatever reason. And then likewise, if it's something that's out of our wheelhouse, say, for example, analyzing a contract or helping transactional law is not something that we typically do. But there's other firms in the area that do transactional work. So we'll typically send that stuff to them.
Awesome. Well, I might dig into that a little bit more, but let's talk about the history of criminal defense. What do you know about the history of criminal defense? And then I'll maybe get into some notes here if you don't cover it.
Well, sure. There's the quick and dirty, as we have some of the notes here, there's the Magna Carta, and ultimately moving away in history of having representative government and realizing that people have rights. And if you are
Magna Carta here is introduced 1215. The idea that no one should be deprived of liberty or property without lawful judgment, paving the way for defense rights. So, sorry.
Right. Yeah. So that's essentially, it's telling the government, okay, if you want to take away someone's freedom, property, or rights, you need to prove it. There has to be due process. They have the right to assert their defense and basically say their piece. And there is a standard of proof that has to be met. Evidence must be brought. And it needs to be decided by, an independent body, whether that be a judge or a jury. So that's where all that kind of stems is from, well, I'm accusing you of something, prove me wrong. It's like, well, no, that's not how this works. If you're accusing me, you prove it. And that becomes the basis for our system. And then, of course, all of that is enshrined with our Bill of Rights in the United States.
Right. And then Becca and I filled in, highly recommend checking out that episode. We filled in the whole, the right to an attorney, Miranda rights. We talked about all that stuff. So we won't go over that again, but that's the United States law is different though than other countries. I assume every country is that Magna Carta is that. I mean, what countries is like Mexico? They have the cartels that kind of control the laws down there more than the government wants us to probably believe or understand. But I'm sure that's like one example, but there's probably lawless areas all over the world that are sort of behind the times with the way that they process law.
Oh, absolutely. So you're really kind of talking about two different things. One where the enforcement of the law is either inadequate or wholly flawed, arguably in a nation like Mexico, where yes, you have all that drug money interfering. You have law enforcement to take bribes, and to the extent where that can be so pervasive that the system itself is in question. And I think the Mexican judicial system probably has a little bit of that reputation. On the other side of it, there can just be distinct differences in how the law operates, even among, a first world country. So I think probably one of the best examples is your Fifth Amendment rights. So here in the U.S., you can plead the Fifth. You are not obligated to speak in a way that would, incriminate yourself. If you take a case to a jury trial and you're the defendant and you assert that right and you do not speak, no one is allowed to use that against you. The prosecutor can't get in front of the jury and say, well, we don't know what happened that night because the defendant here won't get up and talk to you about that. Instant mistrial. Instant mistrial. That's a really, really big deal. Nobody can even remotely suggest to the jury or the fact finder that because they didn't say anything, then you should find them guilty. That's a big no-no. However, in a country like, say, France, for example, the opposite is true. You can be on trial in France, and if you do not speak with law enforcement or decide to speak on your own behalf, the prosecutor can go right to the jury and see, like, well, they won't even tell you what happened. So there is a pretty big difference there. And First Amendment is a lot bigger in the U.S. as well. But yeah, there are definitely differences.
Yeah, obviously the Second Amendment is a thing in the U.S. The First and the Second Amendment are pretty key differences in us and other countries.
Correct. Yes.
How about that legal structure? We talked about it a little bit, the differences in courts locally here. We've talked about it on the show here. The court building or the courthouse, that was almost moved to Detroit Lakes at some point. That was the whole River Inn. I forget what episode we talked about that. I want to say it was the Hotheads, 715 Hotheads. Long time ago, we talked about how the history that went into keeping the court here. And what is that? It's the how many different courts are there? Because this is a regional courthouse, right?
Well, it's a district courthouse, and
courthouse.
In Fergus Falls being the seat here, but it is more. While technically the court systems are based off districts, it does kind of really go by county. So if you are charged in Becker County, you're going to the Becker County Courthouse. Gotcha. Here in Otter Tail, the Otter Tail County Courthouse. So while they're officially labeled as districts, based off where the jurisdiction is, you'll go to a specific.
And
courthouse.
That's regardless of the crime. It's going to happen. Like any crime that's committed here is going to get processed here in Otter Tail County.
There can be some exceptions. Generally, that is true. However, say, for example, if there's an order for protection in place and it's alleged that someone violated that, jurisdiction could be where the protected party is when that violation happened or where the defendant was when they made the alleged violation. So that's an example where you can pick and choose. Or say, for example, if you have a case that goes over multiple jurisdictions. So say, for example, I had a case that ended up going to jury trial that involved a high-speed chase, so felony fleeing as well as a DWI. It originated out of South Dakota and went over multiple counties, and it was ultimately Otter Tail County deputies who were able to stop the vehicle, and it ended in Otter Tail County. But potentially every single county that he drove through, he committed felony fleeing and committed DWI. So ultimately it ended up in Otter Tail because that's where the chase stopped. But in theory, he could have been charged, only in one jurisdiction, but the available jurisdictions were anybody where he went through.
And then the question I asked you the other night at the brewery about like civil court versus criminal court and the differences, I still don't understand. I didn't understand. Maybe this will help me understand it. But is there a different process for civil fines and civil penalties as opposed to criminal court?
Well, in terms of fines or monetary obligations, I think that's probably pretty similar, because really all that's going to happen is at the end of a proceeding, you'll have a judge's order. The judge is ordering you to do something. In a civil case, very frequently to pay some sort of monetary obligation, or if you have a criminal matter, you could be ordered to pay a fine as well. And so those mechanisms are generally the same. I think where the differences become far more pronounced are, there's the differences in the burden of proof is probably the biggest one.
Burden of proof?
Right. So if you sue somebody civilly, generally speaking, the burden of proof is what we call the preponderance of the evidence. It's a 51-49% thing. Are you able to tip the scale enough to prove your case? So that's the lowest form of burden of proof. It's a lot easier to prove something in civil court because the burden of proof is lesser. And then you can move on to more of a middle ground of burden of proof called clear and convincing evidence. So say, for example, you're placed on probation, you're charged with a probation violation. The prosecutor doesn't have to prove you violated probation to beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the clear and convincing evidence, which is generally like, we're 70% sure we've got this, right? And then the highest burden of proof, and the highest burden of proof in American law, of course, is beyond a reasonable doubt, which that's what it takes to sustain a criminal conviction or criminal charge.
So it is easier to process things because you need less conviction or less proof in a civil court as opposed to criminal court.
The weight of the evidence that you would need to bring in a civil matter is not necessarily as heavy as the burden as like a prosecutor has. When you go to a criminal case, especially a jury trial, and you're arguing that reasonable doubt, that's what it is. You are supposed to be dispelling any sort of objective of reasonable doubt the jury may have regarding guilt on any of the elements. And obviously, the defense attorney is trying to do the flip side. They're trying to find some reasonable doubt to disrupt that logic chain in the elements, because if any element is not completely sustained by the reasonable doubt standard, then the person's acquitted. So yes, prosecutors have a much bigger uphill battle in terms of those burdens of proof.
So, and the reason being, and this will connect to the next point, which I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the marijuana legalization. I just kind of want to talk about obviously the reason it gets legalized is to take the burden off of the court system and take the burden off of clogging up the criminal court system in processing this stuff. So, for instance, and this is where I have like some questions about how obviously marijuana is illegal on a federal level, yet it's legal in states. So that is in clear contradiction with national law. And then you have interpretations of, and this is what I was trying to understand the other day is, so HF 100, the Minnesota cannabis legalization bill, states that the fine for public consumption shall be a civic penalty rather than, so it would basically end up in civil the civil court process rather than in a criminal court. So, and this is where I was confused because a petty misdemeanor, which is the penalty in Fergus Falls for public consumption, is that would send it to a criminal court as opposed to a civil court.
Right, and it's very understandable how that can be confusing. So what a petty misdemeanor is, say, for example, a regular speeding ticket would be a petty misdemeanor, or lots of traffic violations are petty misdemeanors. So what that means is that the statutory maximum, the most they can do to you is hit you with a $300 fine. There is no possibility of jail time on a petty misdemeanor, which also means that you do not have the right to a public defender if you are charged with a petty misdemeanor, because there's no possibility of jail time. Public defenders only attach on cases where that's a possibility.
Okay.
Right. And so that's why it's technically civil and not criminal, because there's no possibility of potential jail time. And you also do not have the right to a jury trial. So say, for example, if you are charged with a petty misdemeanor consumption ticket or a petty misdemeanor traffic violation, you have the right to a court trial, but not a jury trial. So those are pretty big distinctive things. But you are correct in that these civil citations are processed in criminal court, which could be a little misleading.
So now the point of it obviously is to equip law enforcement to be able to process and prosecute these things, hold people accountable for the crimes that they commit.
Sure.
So in theory, would it be easier or different or quicker to process that in a civil fine if they were to issue civil fines locally as opposed to petty misdemeanors? Is that something that you need less reasonable doubt, or less evidence essentially?
No, so the proof of beyond a reasonable doubt still applies on these citations. And so I think the system works well the way it is right now. I think that if they moved those citations to a different type of court calendar or proceeding, I think it would get messy and confusing. Because at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of your criminal trial rights or criminal rights in general still apply to those matters. And the process for how they move through the court system is similar enough to the other criminal matters that it kind of makes sense to keep them on that same docket. So the way it's set up does make sense. But yes, people are routinely confused on what is a petty misdemeanor, what's a misdemeanor, what are the differences, because there are many.
Does that something you see? Crimes like tickets being handed out for public consumption of whether it be alcohol or public consumption of marijuana, is that something that you're seeing people get in trouble for?
Myself, no. Typically, a large part of what I deal with and a large part of my intakes have to do with traffic citations. And the vast majority are either speeding tickets, because we have I-94 coming through. So people from all over the world, all over the nation, all over the world, come through that interstate and get picked up for speeding. When I was a prosecutor, I had a guy who got a speeding ticket. He wanted to do a court trial, and we did the court trial while he was in Hong Kong, and it was 3 a.m. for him. And so that happens pretty frequently. The other very large caseload that we get a lot is people who are charged or cited with being on their cell phone while driving.
Oh.
Those hands-free violations, the State Patrol in particular takes those very, very seriously. And in particular, we get a lot of semi-truck drivers who have a commercial driver's license, and that type of citation is very bad for them. But yeah, I can tell everybody here from what I can see, if you're holding your phone to your ear, they're going to pull you over and they're going to give you that citation. And frankly, it's pretty hard to defend against. So don't do that. Utilize your technology. Stay off your phone. It's the safe, right thing to do anyway.
So it's illegal to hold the phone up to your ear while you're driving.
Correct. That's been an update to that statute. So it has gotten stricter. So if you are holding your phone up to your ear or you're holding it in your hand and doing speaker, that's going to be a problem.
I have this thing with my insurance where it's like they track my phone activity, and I I mean, it's good because I'm like one of the worst. Before I started doing this, I was like one of the worst with like texting and driving or looking at my phone while I was driving or just like, and now they track it and they like keep track of every violation. And it's like, I don't know if I don't love it, but it's a good transition into the Big Brother is watching though. Our cell phones.
Yep.
They know everything about us.
Put your phone away while you drive. You have to do it.
And put your phone away. Stay off social media if you don't want the most expansive profile of you ever known to man being built about you, because this is wild. I can only imagine. I would love to know what social media knows about me, because I think I would understand myself. I think that they know me better than I know me, which is crazy to think.
Oh, and I'm sure that's their entire goal. And what you had mentioned before, which I think is very, very interesting, almost like a Minority Report style scenario where you have a social media company having so much data and so much patterns on people where potentially they could predict when a person would commit a crime. I thought that was really, really interesting to think of things that way. And I mean, in theory, I can certainly see where it goes. What I do know what is going on right now that I think it's very, very important for people in general to be aware, but also for parents of teenagers. Obviously, these days, Gen Z in particular, they communicate by their phones. They communicate through Snapchat, Instagram, whatever it may be. All of these messages, videos, etc., they don't go away. As we all know, you can delete something off your phone. It's not really deleted. And in particular, if you're sending it over the internet and a company is processing that, that's stored on their servers. Now, you had mentioned, these algorithms and things like that. And so in addition, are they trying to, push content towards you, obviously, trying to figure out what you like, what you don't like, so they can better give you the content you're looking for. However, there are also algorithms that will flag certain pieces of language and certain things that are said, and then they flag it to law enforcement. So you could very well be sending what you believe to be a private message to somebody, and on an app that you think possibly deletes it right away and does not otherwise keep a record of that. Be very careful about that, because that can be flagged to law enforcement if you say something that they believe is sufficiently illegal. They can come knocking on your door. So that's why it's very important for, parents and kids these days to educate your kids. It's not like when I was growing up or you were growing up or our parents growing up, where people could generally just say and do whatever they want and no one's really recording it and reporting it. That's not the case for our kids these days. So parents need to be aware. Kids need to be aware. Be careful what you say online.
It says here, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986. We're a little outdated there. 1986. It says it just has not been amended properly to keep up with technology. So I assume that the rapid expanse, it takes so long to create and pivot and process new laws, get stuff through the system, get stuff implemented and rolled out. There's no way we could possibly keep up with how fast technology is moving. I think that's we're trying to play catch up probably in that Big Brother aspect of protecting people. So, what else are you seeing? Are you allowed to talk about any? Have you seen any digital? Do you guys handle any digital crime stuff? Is that something you see? Digital crime, cyber crime?
Well, there's certainly aspects of, like, say, for example, very common in a harassment restraining order case, people going after each other on social media, posting things about each other, things like that. And so that very frequently becomes an issue of when I'm settling a matter like that. It will be very frequently to have in the agreement, both parties are going to scrub all mentions of the other party from their social media. That's very common. And then you can get into the criminal realm as well. I mean, there is crimes against hacking into someone's device. Cyberbullying, to the extent, could in fact be a form of harassment if you meet certain parameters. And then and I haven't dealt with this too much, but there is like the revenge pornography law as well. People or the non-consensual dissemination of sexual images, as the statute's called, if you want to get real legalese about it. But yeah, that's basically one of those scenarios where, you know, a couple is together and perhaps they've exchanged explicit material with the understanding it was going to be private, and then that relationship ends, and the one person decides to post that stuff on the internet without the other person's knowledge, and that's a felony. And it is a very, very serious thing, and that's something else that, you know, parents need to be discussing with their kids as well. Is that can get in a felony criminal world pretty fast with that type of stuff. Yeah. So yes.
Yeah, the internet is a weird world. It's a weird space. I feel bad for the kids that are growing up in it. I got a 17-year-old brother now, and they just talk to each other on the internet. It's weird. It's just weird. It's
and
weird
everything's recorded. Everything's recorded.
Everything's recorded. Yep. Anything else you want the people to know about Cadem Law? What you guys do, how they can get a hold of you guys. I'll get into some other stuff here to cap us off, but anything else about Cadem Law?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find us on Google and a lot of the other legal review sites. We have a lot of positive reviews on Google. I encourage you to go check that out. Yeah, we do a lot of criminal defense, a lot of family law. We do other things as well. Yeah, give us a call. And even if you don't think that your matter necessarily fits into our wheelhouse, you know, we'll figure that out. And we're always interested in interesting cases, and yeah.
And if you're a veteran facing a DUI, there's no better person to call than Jake, because from my understanding, there's very few people that are actually doing the legwork to use this. I call it a loophole. I don't know what I mean. I don't understand it. So it feels like a loophole to me, but it's the law. It's using the law to the advantage of somebody who has faced serious setbacks in life as a result of serving our country.
Right. And a loophole, I mean, when I hear the term loophole, I more think of like, well, you're getting off on a technicality, or there's some sort of unintended gap in the law that someone's exploiting. Here, I mean, I would call it maybe it's technically pretrial diversion. Diversion's a good word. Maybe a more colloquial word would be like kind of an off-ramp, in recognition that someone has served their country and has had something happen to them because of that service, and now they are facing criminal charges in part because of what's happened to them while they served their country. That's the general idea. So it is all about, as the act says, it's about mitigation. It's about pretrial diversion. It's about getting these people the help they need, because especially on these higher level cases, you know, are they getting help for their mental health in jail? No. They're probably going to get out of custody eventually. Do they have a job anymore? Do they have a criminal history that now is going to severely prohibit them from doing what they want to do? I mean, these are questions that have to be asked. And is it appropriate in every case? No. There is a lot of legwork that has to be done. But yes, my understanding is I'm one of the very few attorneys in this area who knows about that law and knows how to use it. And I've had a proven track record of getting it through the court system.
When I first met you at Outstate, it was giving off some Better Call Saul vibes. I was like, yeah, if I needed somebody on retainer, somebody who was willing to, you know, work for their client to the fullest extent of their ability, you were giving off some vibes that like, you be my guy.
I appreciate that. Thank
you. Let's get into biggest surprise, and then I'll ask best business advice. But first, I want to know the biggest surprise you've seen in your time, whether it be from your time as a clerk to prosecutor to now your current position, just biggest surprise.
I think one of the biggest surprises, and not necessarily something I've learned recently, but I've learned over my career, and I get this question a lot, and I believe that you and I had talked about this previously as well, but, you know, how hard or easy it is to jump from prosecution to defense. And the reality is, and like, on how do you switch your mindset and how you analyze things. And my answer has always been that as a prosecutor, I had to think like a defense attorney. And as a defense attorney, I have to think like a prosecutor in order to understand where the other side's coming from, where they may go, how a case is going to shake out. So really, at the end of the day, I mean, the law is the same for both sides. The law is what the law is. The rules of criminal procedure and courtroom procedure are the same. And it all comes down to, obviously you're looking at things at different angles, but you still have to get into the mindset of the other party. So in that sort of reality, it was not hard for me to understand, a client's perspective or the way this shakes out or what the defense's, theory of the case should be or what their position should be. Because as a prosecutor, I had to think about that stuff anyway.
How about best business advice?
Best business advice, stay organized. If you're an attorney in a firm, stay highly organized, and you need to be prompt on your communications. That's probably bothers people the most with the legal profession is an attorney who does not get back to them and leaves them hanging in the wind. So we really pride ourselves on prompt communication, thorough communication. We'll return your phone call, reply to that email, because almost every time people are in one of the worst situations they've ever been, anxiety is high, stress is high. They need that person to be there for them, and that's something I think we do rather well. In terms of best business practice, if you are a prospective client, please don't call us and say, I have a contested hearing tomorrow. Can you help me? If you have a legal matter, and you have a court hearing coming up, or that you are going to need help, call us sooner rather than later. Obviously, lawyers are very busy, calendars can fill up, and time is needed to prepare your case. So that's probably the biggest piece of advice I can give is, don't wait. If you think you're going to need legal help, help us help you with giving us enough time.
Awesome. Well, anything else you wanted to add, touch on at all before we got out of here today?
Well, you had kind of mentioned, some of the parts of the marijuana legalization, and I think the deal with the federal, the difference between the federal law, largely what it comes down to is the access to the banking system. Oh. And in my opinion, that is what really needs to be fixed with how many states that just have full-blown legalization. You have companies who are legally operating, but they can't access the banking system because of the federal regulation. And that causes a lot of issues. You have all these businesses operating off a cash basis, which can invite, criminal activity, and, there are all sorts of problems there. So obviously under the Obama administration, a directive was given to the Department of Justice not to go after dispensaries that are operating within local state laws, despite it being federally illegal. So that's where that government approach has come from. But ultimately, I think in that topic, what really needs to happen at federal level is they need to address the banking regulations.
Yeah, like banking's a big part. Obviously, that's a public safety issue. That is like when you want to talk about if there's a public safety issue involved in it. If you're walking out of your store every night with huge amounts of cash, or storing that cash for a long period of time at a location that you have to figure out how to protect, that does create a safety issue for the business owner, know? So, and from a consumer's perspective, whereas you can possess up to 2 pounds of cannabis at home, you can go to jail for that on a federal level still. They could, if they wanted to, they could come and they could arrest you for having what is a legal amount. So it's just I will be curious to see how that all shakes out, but ultimately whatever the step above you is precedes like that has weight, right? Like state law holds weight over local law, city law, right? And then national law holds weight over whatever's going on in the state and the city.
Typically speaking, yeah, a law can override it. But what you said in the first place is correct in terms of, if you were to deal with a federal law enforcement official, yeah, they're operating under federal law, and that's different. And so that's where it comes down to, the prosecutorial and the law enforcement discretion. Which is what I mentioned with the Obama administration giving an official directive of saying, well, okay, technically, yes, we could go do this. We could go send the DEA to Colorado or wherever there's an established dispensary and go operate off that federal law and go seize their stuff. But they've explicitly decided not to do that for a wide variety of reasons. So, yeah, I mean, it comes down to discretion. And unless and until that's officially changed, whether marijuana comes off, the drug schedule, or they do something.
But those would have to be feds. Those would have to be like DEA feds coming in and like state and local law enforcement can't prosecute.
Correct.
They can only prosecute their own local laws. So that would have to be like a federal agent coming in and handing out these violations in our state or in our county.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, thank you very much, man. I appreciate your time. You lawyers, your time is not cheap. So I appreciate it. I hear you guys bill every 6 minutes to keep it easy, the math.
It's true.
Just cut it up into 6-minute chunks. So if you're ever talking with a lawyer, don't hold them for an extra minute if it's going to put you into the next 6-minute chunk. It's my best business advice. Anyways, thank you to the sponsors: Atlas Outdoor Services, Outstate Brewing, Stumbinos, Victor Lundeen's Lakes Area Grow Co., and Fergus Home and Hardware.
Thanks for having me.
Uh-huh.